Um, so basically I had called or reached out to do this because I don't know anyone else that I think has dove into um, all of the domains that I've been exploring aside from you. I mean, I know that you've dove into Christian Science and into sort of nature and evolution and patterns that kind of work, as well as coherence, information systems, the relationship between physical phenomena and linguistics, the description of attempts to describe that physical phenomena, um, and coherence kind of occurs in all of those. Like, it occurs in the physical world. You have things organizing and sort of patterns happening at a level, but then that's interacting both at the larger with the larger ecosystem around it, as well as the individual parts within it, and each of those have sort of coherences as well. And then that also occurs in the linguistic sense around a representation of that layer. And so I'd played with this stuff quite a bit before, but my most recent sort of forays were largely kicked off by trying to think through basically I was playing with an analogy that proved really fruitful over the last 6 months or so for me. And it was just, hey, what if you thought of a social group as sort of like a cell, and there was a membrane, what's the relationship between the world outside and the world inside? And it's not that they're entirely separate, right? There's a protocol essentially determining what comes in and what goes out, and that kind of stuff. And I was trying to think through what is how do you describe those interactions in the cellular world, and then what does that look like when you're talking about a group? And the basic place that I came to with regard to some of that stuff was, okay, so the first off, what is the membrane in a social group? And from my perspective, that gets determined within the minds of each individual, basically, each individual member of the group. You do have some things like legal rules and contracts and things like that can influence who you treat as outsider, who you treat as insider, and what kind of resources come in and all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, it isn't a clearly defined thing. It's something that's a little bit malleable, and that is determined by how each of those individuals identifies themselves. Do they see the other entity that they're interacting with as part of me, part of us, or as separate, and all that kind of stuff? And then the other line of inquiry that was sort of fruitful about a year or so ago, I had seen something on this infinity jellyfish, right? And there was this guy who was fascinated with or eternity jellyfish might have been it. Eternity jellyfish. It's basically this jellyfish that when you kill it or stab it, it changes into this sort of ooze, and then it regenerates. And so it kind of goes back to very basic, its same genetic code, and then reblooms. And it has no memory of the previous life or whatever, but you kind of can't kill the thing, was sort of the idea. And this guy was super fascinated by that because he was going, we could figure out eternal life. And I was going, well, that's a really weird way to think of life, and I I started sort of that kind of kicked me down this path of, that's not really what life is about. Life is, at the end of the day, what is the layer at which evolution happens? It doesn't happen amongst individuals. Evolution is about essentially genes when you're talking about biological organisms, and evolutionary pressures. All of the patterns. I'm starting to like ramble, but the long story short is, when you look out on the world and you look at nature, you see the winners, right? Like the only stuff that's here is the stuff that kind of like works at some level. And when you look at the larger patterns that work, there is you basically have something that finds food, right? Like for a long time, there may be a resource sitting on the ground and nothing knows how to use that. And so it's just the stuff sitting there. Maybe it's alkaline or something like that. And then something comes along that's like, oh, a mutation happens. And something comes along that's like, I know how to, that's food. And for this organism, suddenly it's like, oh my God, there's food everywhere, and it blooms and the shape of the ecosystem changes quite radically. All of a sudden there's a bunch of these things. And it may hit sort of an upper limit. Maybe predators come along, or it reaches the end of that food supply, and it sort of comes to some sort of balance. And then something else comes along, and it goes, "Oh my gosh, that's food!" This new organism, or it starts competing for that other resource, whatever. And so it's a constantly shifting dynamic, right? And I ended up diving into, okay, well, in that context, what when you look at life writ large, what ends up winning? And it's some amount of there's cooperation that kind of emerges. There's also not out of intent necessarily, but just out of like, hey, this happened with enough iterations. Like if I'm here and that guy's there and this guy's over here, then we have sort of this feedback loop that works and supports all of us, and we can be stable. The other piece is a fairly like obvious and widely known one that has to do with diversity yielding resilience. So if your environment is kind of harsh and at times it shifts and becomes really cold, the things that can't survive in the cold, they all die off. But if you have enough diversity in your gene pool, you have resilience. There's ones that can maybe survive that cold, and they are able to carry that genetic material through those narrowings. And when there is the big bloom of population during those growth periods, or during whatever period, if there's a big bloom of population, and the collaboration amongst the individuals within that community, whether they are intentional or non-intentional, that collaboration actually enables a much wider diversity of life to survive, because it sort of acts as a buffer to the things that would kill them off. A lot of the diversity that exists at any one point in time is kind of diversity that doesn't seem relevant. It doesn't hurt us at all, but it's not really helping. And then some set of conditions come along, and it's all of a sudden, everybody else died, and these ones made it through. Anyway, so some of the stuff that I started to play with had to do with some of it had to do with these, higher levels of the patterns that work, these higher levels of collaboration that get favored. And some of that some of the stuff I started to play with had to do with a recognition that I'd had for a long time around, coming back to what I'd mentioned earlier with social groups, identity. And I feel like a lot of what Christian Science does, and I think a lot of other religions do this as well, is they shift identity from being, this physical body is me, to life in a larger sense, and not just biology, but all of the things that we interact with is me, that we are one with this larger universe, and that actually ends up getting favored evolutionarily, because there are benefits to that, coming back to the whole, this isn't about individuals, it's about genes and all that kind of stuff. And at the same time, that the area where I've kind of gone, yeah, I don't know, like how do I frame this? I feel like Christian Science has been, well, I'll take a step even away from Christian Science. I don't think it's possible for us to know objective reality, right? Like there may be an objective reality, but we can't know for certain what that is. We can sense the reality that we are able to perceive, and using our direct and our indirect sensing capacities, whether that's through tools or through stories from others, that they've shared about their experiences, or through, things that we've thought of in our head, we are able to describe things that work or don't work. But at the end of the day, whether it's true or not is not actually relevant. Like, what ends up being relevant is it useful? And our attempts to describe the world, regardless of whether or not they are true, may prove useful. And when it comes to sort of information and language and the description of physical phenomena, Plato and Aristotle had kind of dove into this stuff a bit. And I think, if I'm remembering correctly, the way that Plato described it is like, oh, there's these two separate realms. There's like the physical world, and then there's the world of ideas. And in my mind, this is kind of how Christian Science approaches it, right? Christian Science is like, there's this spiritual realm that is real. And then there's this physical realm that is sort of a reflection of that, but it's a false one, or it's not substantial, or something along those lines. And I think Aristotle was more like, no, no, it's not. And for me, the place that I've kind of come to is, yes, there are an infinite number of ideas available. There's an infinite number of ways of describing this stuff, but that's not a separate universe. That's not a place independent of this. That is, you've got circles that we have in the world, and one way to describe them would be, it's a line in a two-dimensional plane where every point is an equal distance from this other point that we'll call the center. So they're all exactly the same distance. And that's it's a shorthand way to deal with the concept of circle. And we are able to observe some things like the relationship between the diameter and the perimeter and all of that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, it's inaccurate, right? At the end of the day, there is nothing in the physical world that actually behaves that way. It's a really useful approximation, right? But there's nothing that actually behaves that way. And the other sort of related concept to that that I was thinking about just a couple days ago had to do with the relationship between finite and infinite mathematics. And at the end of the day, going, this cup, one cup, one glass, two glasses, etc. The lie at the beginning of that is that this is separate from everything around it, and I'm able to kind of carve that off, and it's a really useful lie. Right? Or not a lie, but it's a really useful approximation, but it ends up being
oversimplification. Yeah.
Yeah. So I just kind of wanted to throw some of that stuff out there. The main thing for me was the problem that I have with Christian Science at the moment is, even though I think that they kind of get at a lot, Mrs. Eddy gets at a lot of this these patterns in a way that is really useful. I think she does it from this place that ends up basically saying, this actually isn't real at all. The only thing that's real is those ideas. And from my perspective, the useful side of that is it makes it easy for you to go, okay, I'm gonna give. I'm gonna contribute to others. I'm going to focus on healing, helping. I'm going to, not get bogged down in claims of physical limitation, et cetera, et cetera. And that ends up in a variety of ways being really empowering. And at the same time, there's an almost there's basically no attention paid to this coherence layer and the maintenance of it. And it, as I said before, it kind of adopts that Platonic concept where the ideas are real and the physical is not. And I've kind of come to a place where I'm like, no, I think it may be the other way around. So, yeah, but it does enable awareness at sort of those higher levels of sort of collaboration, coordination, et cetera. So I just kind of wanted to throw, that's a bunch of stuff to dump on the table, right? But I wanted to throw that out and kind of ask you where your, kind of what your journey through some of this territory was like, and get any thoughts on where you've come more recently.
All right. I have been jotting some notes about what you were saying and also making some notes about things to talk about. So, yeah. The Platonic, the idealistic, the Berkeley's idealism and Christian Science and Advaita Vedanta Hinduism and these things that basically call the spirit real, and then but Plato, I think, was a little more dualistic about it. He's like, they're both real. One is real in ideal form and one is real in tangible experience, but the tangible experience is like a weak approximation of the ideal form, so that you've got the kind of dualism there. And I think the trap, you kind of referred to it. The trap is just because, just because we can use language to draw lines, like this is a glass, this is the material, this is the spiritual, this is, right? Just because we can use language to draw lines doesn't make those lines real. And for me personally, this was the lesson that led me away from any kind of reductive form of reality, reductive worldview of reality, whether it's reductive materialism as our scientific, mainstream Western scientific model will tend to be, which is like, if we can't touch, it's not out here. If it isn't, physical, tasteable, touchable, measurable with scientific instruments, then it's not real. Again, because we can draw a line, conceptual line, as if that line creates reality. And Christian Science draws the line and then says the opposite, says spirit is real, matter is an illusion. And they both reduce everything in opposite directions. Just because we can draw a conceptual line, they then throw out everything on the other side of that line. And it's interesting that you are also talking about membranes, because membranes are another kind of line, but they're not a conceptual line per se. They're a functional line. And to me, this is actually part of the vital shift that I moved toward in having a more holistic worldview versus reductive worldviews. But still, I found power in Christian Science. I had, miraculous healings and things like that. Those were, so to just throw all that out, it seems stupid, right? There's power available in Western science as well, you know, like this. So how do you hold all of it? And for me, moving to a more holistic perspective where you don't throw out something just because you can draw conceptual lines, and you start figuring out like what works, what the patterns are that weaves it all together. And what's interesting to me is this thing of membranes is, I'm trying to figure out which order to jump into these in, because you talked about evolution and, you know, all of these things, but the glass that you held in your hand.
Yeah.
You were talking about that there's a kind of lie, that it's separate from everything. And that's true on lots of different levels. You know, like it's also a lie that it's one thing, right? Because it's all these little tiny subatomic things doing this dance, creating a kind of coherent field that we then experience as one thing. And yet that dance isn't very different than the dance with your hand when you're holding the glass, you know, like there's some, so what's the functional difference? And what is really exciting to me is actually the shift that I feel like we're on the edge of as a species, from what I would call a scientific worldview to a systemic worldview, from object-centric reality to flow-centric reality. Because in a flow-centric reality, there are membranes, but all membranes are temporary and permeable, right? They're not defining in an absolutist sense, you know, like they're a part of, they change a pattern of flow in terms of how long they may hold something or block something, or what kind of transformation that something may need to go through to pass through the membrane, or what rate at which it may pass through the membrane, or right, but everything, you know, the membranes are still all passable eventually, you know, like even the sealed glass jar that we put something in eventually breaks, you know, like it even though it may seem like an impermeable membrane for some period of time.
Yeah.
And it starts to tell a different story when you think of flow and you have that glass in your hand, right? That glass came from somewhere. The silica that you know was melted from sand that formed that glass, or maybe it came from partially recycled materials, and then when it falls off your desk and breaks on the floor, you know, and you sweep it onto a dustpan and it gets recycled, or it goes into the trash dump and gets recycled over a different timeline, you know, in different ways, or it gets incorporated into some art piece, and you know, like whatever the thing is, all of these things are flowing. And we tend to think that object as if it is almost a platonic object, like as if it is a thing that has actual existence. And that's that lie that you're talking about, right? It's flowing and transforming. Everything is flowing and transforming. And then the ticket is, what are the things that shape those patterns of transformation? And how do we dance with them? And how do we read them? And how do we translate them into the social spaces where we're trying to create new kinds of coherence? And I love that you're using the word coherence, because for me, coherence is central to creative power, because it is, if you think about it, it is anti-entropy. Entropy is essentially incoherence. It's the breaking down of patterns, and the coherence is the assembling of them. And so coherence ends up being key in creative power. So if we want to have creative power on the level of social institutions, membranes, patterns, you know, you started talking about membranes and cells in that regard, and we're talking about how, you know, well, sometimes they're just psychological or whatever. I'm not sure that that's true. I mean, yes, that may be true. Sometimes they're just psychological, but sometimes they're very real. And being able to understand and use and utilize them. We actually talk about this a bunch, and it's one of the things that we just did at Alf Summer. You were asking about how Alf Summer went, and we were talking about what are the membranes for Alfdom, for becoming an agile learning facilitator, you know, and like the first one, and we have crazy names for them now too, you know, is being an Alf egg, right? And an Alf egg is simply an act of declaration that you want to Alf, that you want to develop yourself in this domain, that you've discovered this domain and you want to pursue it. And you haven't necessarily taken any action yet. You don't know if you're ever going to start a school or work in a school or whatever, but you've like put yourself on this path. So that is a particular kind of membrane of self-identification with something, right? So that's the Alf egg. And then we're going into this whole baking metaphor, right? So then we have kneaded, Knead, right? The kneading of dough. You become a kneaded Alf when you find a place to participate. If you're volunteering at a school or you are signed up for Alf Summer training, or right now you're a kneaded Alf. And then, you know, there's this whole Alf rising process that you're engaged in after that. And then when you get a peer review where your peers say you successfully hold the space that we're trying to create with kids, wait, let me rephrase that. In a space where Alfing is available, you do it successfully with kids. You relate to them in the way that we're wanting you to relate to them, and that kind of thing. And right? So then you're a baked Alf. And so defining what the crossings of the membranes were, like a peer review kind of thing, and also defining what is relevant to a person at the different stages. There's different questions that are relevant when you're at different stages of a membrane. There's a different focus that you have. There's a threshold that you're crossing. There's different language that speaks to people at these different levels, you know. And this is very real, and I think very powerful in organizing social systems, because we have like these weird kind of ideals about transparency and open sourciness and whatever. And the problem is, if you are holding coherence for something, you have developed distinctions and relationships in language that represent the thing that you're holding coherence for. And you have shorthand for being able to reference some of these things. And that shorthand is completely inaccessible to people who don't understand the relationships embodied in that shorthand. And so you can say a statement which inside of the context of shared language is completely clear and obvious, but outside of that context sounds irresponsible and, you know, naive and whatever. And so the idea that you can just have transparency across 10 layers of membranes and that somehow is going to work, is
not accurate. Yeah, totally crazy.
Right. And yet we think that that's what we're supposed to do. I say we, being sort of some kind of liberal social equity agenda, you know, like the way you can really, you know, be accessible as if you're completely transparent and all that kind of stuff. And I think that's very wrong-headed.
Totally.
That the way to be accessible is to actually create clear steps. And that's what the membranes are, and understanding what is relevant to people at each step and giving them a clear path for how they can clear that next hurdle, that next pass through that next threshold. They could potentially jump through many very quickly or even all at once, but to even identify that they have or make it visible that they can, you know, like I think of when I visited Findhorn a few years ago, and they were talking about how for many years they really had a hard time onboarding people into the community. Like the community kind of stagnated in terms of its growth and incorporation of new members. It had grown very large, but then it sort of stopped. And then they created.
Which community was that?
This is Findhorn in Scotland, an eco village.
Okay. Okay.
Northern Scotland. And then they created these processes of sort of a visiting week kind of thing, and then an internship, and then you've stated your intention to join the community, and you're kind of in a residential trial period, all that kind of stuff. And then all of a sudden they have people joining the community again. And I don't think it's because you could say they kind of erected a bunch of barriers, but you could also say they created an on-ramp. That what was happening was you somehow had to get from 0 to 60 with no acceleration period, right? You had to be able to jump from I'm an outsider to I'm an insider with no path how to step up these steps. And there's very few people who can make that jump without given a path where they can clear little steps and hurdles. And so anyway, this membrane stuff I think is very vital to social collective intelligence and the kinds of coherence that we need to create new kinds of healthy patterns of intentional cultures and everything. So I think it's great that you were talking about that right out of the gates. And I have a diagram of some of this stuff that I could share with you as well if you
would love it.
Are interested.
There's two things that you had mentioned that kind of I was like, oh yeah, I should probably bring that up. One had to do, you mentioned entropy, and I saw somebody came out with a book recently dealing with entropy and information and order, and they were trying to make sense of all this, and I haven't read the book. I just read the review online, but from my perspective, information and our interpretation of that information, whether it's orderly or chaotic, is a matter of perspective. Kind of as you were pointing out before, in a particular place in space-time, and equipped with particular sensing faculties and knowledge from previous, you may perceive this thing as really orderly or constructed in a way that is useful, or something to be ignored entirely. An environment that is all oxygen, is in one sense really orderly, but it wouldn't be life supporting for something that needs oxygen and soil and nitrogen and the various other things. And so to that kind of entity, it would just be something to ignore almost. And so the point that I was trying to make there basically is that our interpretation of order always that is something that always happens from a particular perspective in terms of both location as well as sensing capabilities. And then the other thing, and I had this concept for a long time, but I've only recently, I think, gotten good at explaining it. So there are a lot of people who are trying to build information technology systems to help our world work better. People who came to the collaborative internet meetups that I was organizing, and people who I love, dearly. Like they are, trying to do good work, and a lot of what they're trying to build is in the right, in my mind, in the right way. But you and Eric and a handful of other people are the very few that are going at it. I'm not even going to talk about the way that you're building it, because I think that's right too. But the goal that you're striving for is a different goal. And it's a similar goal to what I've been striving for. And the way that I've come to describe this is a lot of those people are searching for technology to lead us to abundance. And I think abundance is totally the wrong goal. The not that having much is good, but what abundance really means at the end of the day is having so much that we don't have to be sensitive, having so much that we are divorced from the pain of our actions. And for me, pain is at one level a sensing mechanism. Pain literally means the ability to feel the impacts. Not that pain is entirely good, but that the real goal at the end of the day is to develop at higher levels of coherence, right, within larger community structures, et cetera, as well as on the individual layers, the ability to sense, and through that, the ability to regulate. And so, for you've described this stuff as, OS Earth, and I've taken to kind of describe it in a similar way. I've sort of started describing like what is the problem that I'm working on to people. Hey, we don't have a regulatory system that works at the scales at which we operate. We literally aren't able to steer our behavior in ways that allow us to steward, the resources. We are unable to control ourselves. And there's game theory ways of describing this and all of that. But at the end of the day, it's like, no, we literally are operating at a scale at which we are incapable of sensing and steering sensing the impacts of a potential behavior and then making a decision about which behavior to make in these sort of distributed ways that you would have to do in order for it to work well. And your point that you just made about that the problem with that whole transparent across all these different layers of coherence, like not going to work. That's the same exact problem that happened with people in politics wanting to go to replace the messiness of sort of democracy and capitalism and markets with the cleanness of a scientifically guided single governmental entity that would, organize the production of wealth and then distribute the production. Essentially, socialist movements, they suffer from the exact same problem. They try to have everything cohere at the full group size, and that's just not a functional way to organize an ecosystem. Like when you recognize that, hey, we are an ecosystem, and there are these patterns in. When you look at nature, you see, oh, that's how ecosystems function well. There are things that are a particular shape that solve a problem and make decision making and can understand things in this context. I can kind of leave it there. I think you know all the remainder of what I would say there. In that regard, I did recently pick up Paul Kraffel's book, Seeing Nature, because Nancy had mentioned it. I've only started reading it. I'm like 10 pages in, but I was like, oh yeah, this will be good stuff along those lines. And,
yeah, I that's on my list. So, because I want to respond to the things you were just saying. So you were talking about order and the perception of order and that kind of thing. And so I want to clarify something for myself that showed up when you were saying that about thermodynamics. So if you think about it, so thermodynamics are really about the dynamics of heat as a kind of energy. Now, heat, interestingly, is kind of disorderly, right? Heat is random kinetic energy. It's a kind of disorder. Now, it's a kind of disorder that has energetic value, but maybe in the realm of heat, meaning energetic value, meaning we can harness heat to create types of energies that we can use that do work for us, right? But heat is already pretty random. It's already pretty disorderly. And so when we're talking about the dynamics of heat, thermodynamics, and we say in the second law of thermodynamics that basically heat is always transferred from things that are hotter to things that are colder, not the other way around. It's sort of like, duh.
Because it's random.
Well, because it doesn't go where it doesn't have it. It goes where it is, like it bleeds
goes where
out.
it isn't.
Like,
Yeah, because heat is the thing. If heat is the thing that is substantial, kind of like light. Like there's no, my dad's Christian Science metaphors. There's no way to create a flash dark. You know, you can create a flashlight.
right,
You can't create a flash dark.
right,
Yeah.
exactly. So, but the thing is that we've extended this simplification into all forms of energy and into like, and we speak culturally of entropy as this law that things break down, and that, you know, and if you think about it, it may actually just be, it may be that thermodynamics really only applies to this random kinetic energy, not to different types of order, which are the opposite of entropy and are creating new patterns and building up new ways that energy can be held and then can still break down and all of that. But it also, I find it interesting. This is something that I blogged about this. It's coming back as I'm talking about it. I find it interesting sometimes, like maybe there's messages from the universe about particular universal principles. Like if it's about, maybe the law of thermodynamics is actually telling us about how we're supposed to share. It's that people who have things should always be transferring to people who don't, rather than the other way around. You know, that wealth should always be being dissipated and not concentrated, you know. And anyway, it's just it's a funny thing.
I'll kind of dive in just briefly to that. I think that when you think about, and I know I love your work on wealth. I don't know if I'd mentioned this to you yet, but I was in a meeting with Christopher Allen recently, and he asked if anybody was familiar with Brockian wealth. And I was like, I know Brockian wealth, you know. But I was a little while ago, I was thinking about what does wealth look like in a village type context. And when you're living in that small of a community, you're not able to accumulate wealth in a way that ends up insulating you from the community, right? There's no way for you to get to so much wealth because it's all personal relationships at the end of the day when you're at that small scale. So you could have a whole bunch of stuff, but if you're a jerk, people are like, screw that guy, you know? And there's a couple of things that come from that I kind of walked away with as a result of that. One was when you look at the context in which, you know, the forms that humans take, and I'll sort of focus specifically on particular neurophysiologies, and the behavioral tendencies of those individuals. So in particular, I want to focus on low empathy versus high empathy individuals, right? And I think there is a spectrum that sort of exists, that exists there. And I'll sort of summarize by saying low empathy individuals end up not sensing the impacts of their actions very much. They end up not feeling those, they end up not internalizing those very much. High empathy individuals do internalize not just their impacts, but they feel the things, you know, going, you know, affecting others around them. And both of those have value. You know, the ability to sense what's going on around allows you to kind of wisely steer through, oh, you know, if I do this, it's going to have that impact and this impact. And it's not only something that you're able to objectively see, but you're able to feel and thus prioritize. Whereas low empathy individuals, and the extreme of this would be, you know, sociopaths, low empathy individuals don't get distracted by that. So they're able to, you know, here's the goal, and we're going to take these steps to do the goal. Oh, yeah, a bunch of guys are going to die, but, you know, but we have to accomplish the goal. And because they don't internalize the pain of, you know, our young men dying, they're able to send them into battle and attack the village next door and, you know, achieve the goal, and not be the village that gets attacked. And so all of that kind of, I've had a relationship not too long ago that helped me parse through all of that, because we were very different in terms of our empathy types. And but the one thing that was very clear to me was that whole evolutionary history had happened in a context where your sociopaths are still restrained by the very personal nature of their relationships and the ways that they would get value. And when you move into a context where you are able to create wealth or generate and extract wealth here, and then use that over here, and these communities are entirely divorced, you basically have taken the leash off of the sociopath.
Exactly. And when you have money, when you have a currency that anonymizes the impact and turns everything into a one-dimensional metric of value, and then your accounting method for what's happening has erased all of the impact. And
that's right.
You not only have unleashed the sociopaths, but you've set up a system that is designed to be able to reward them.
And not just reward them, but rewards them for particular types of behavior. Because you do want people who are low empathy, you want them unleashed in some sense, right? You want them, there's value sort of in the total transparency thing that we were talking earlier. Like there's real value in being able to go, hey, that's the goal. Let's go get that goal taken care of. And at the same time, it's not just that they've been unleashed, because it's not like, oh, this is now in neutral territory. Like their behavior is literally being shaped by the values of that single value currency system. And the failing of, in my mind, the failing of that approach mirrors the failing of a socialist governmental structure, right? In that we are only able, the system is only able to take into account the values that are shared kind of across the whole. And it's this sort of mushing together of value. And you end up having those currencies. And in my mind, currency, and I'm explaining this more to people at home and not to you. Currency has to do with communication. It has to do with signal. And that form of signal is it's a one-size-fits-all form of signal. And as a result, it forces us to communicate only particular information. And oftentimes much of that information ends up being, how scarce is this? And it doesn't communicate other forms of information like, was this produced in the right way? How did they behave? All of these things that we are not necessarily going to agree about the norm on, those end up falling by the wayside, and we end up literally trying to regulate and handle that stuff through an external third party. We end up, today, we try to use government to solve those shortcomings of the market. And my belief is that the stuff that I want to build and the stuff that you guys are building is really an attempt to address that, to enable those communications internal to themselves, to essentially enabling there to be other currencies in the game, so that without having to come to a consensus about what the rules are, what's valuable, etc., we are able to have that information flow along, and thus enable people to go, oh, yes, it's cheaper, but they used slaves, and not only do I not like the use of slaves, but I know anybody who's going to buy from me isn't going to like the use of slaves, so I need to turn away from them despite it being cheaper.
Right. So you talked about evolution early on in the call, and you talked about, finding food, and, you talked about evolution in a little bit of a context that I feel like has been pop culturalized as kind of the competition-based sense of evolution, that which can find food and all that, and then can flourish. And I like that you're reading Kraffel right now, because he puts forward a very different picture of evolution as not survival of the fittest, but survival of the fit. And fit actually has to do that with meaning that which fits, not.
Because if you didn't fit, you would create negative externalities that would eventually extinguish you.
Exactly.
Like in a very short cycle. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Depending on the scale of your ecosystem that you have to reside in. So, for example, as humans, we are taking over the whole planet ecosystem, and we are creating negative externalities, which could cause our extinction if we don't restore our place in a fit. And so one of the patterns of this fit, you haven't watched the upward spiral video, have you?
I don't think I have, no.
Okay. I'm going to send you a link to a video, which is Paul Kraffel telling some of the stories that are in the book that you'll be reading. But and if you watch my edit of it, I think I have it edited down to 42 minutes or something. It's not extremely long, but it gives some of the highlights. The way he talks about it in that movie, to bring back to thermodynamics, is he talks about the second law of thermodynamics is shaping our universe, and so we have different responses to it. There's what he calls first response to the second law of thermodynamics and the second response to the second law of thermodynamics, which I find very lengthy and unwieldy ways of referring to these things. Yeah. My
You've got things showing up everywhere, huh?
Same thing, but it's a call coming in on my computer, my phone. But I had multiple windows in which the call was coming in.
You're playing whack-a-mole with your phone call.
Exactly. So I have a simpler way of referring to those things, which is, if you think of the second law of thermodynamics creating a kind of scarcity effect of energy, right? We have the first response, which I would call get mine. And that's the kind of find food scenario that you were talking about, right? And that's one part of the picture, is to survive, you have to be in the game of getting enough of what you need to survive. Sure.
I totally hear that, and there was some amount of that, but from my perspective, it was, hey, there's something now to do this job that hadn't been done before.
Right.
Right.
But that begins to point to the second response, which I call grow hours, which is ways of changing the patterns to actually increase the net amount of energy available by changing patterns of flow that make that energy available longer to more things rather than have it dissipate, quickly. And so there's the get mine and grow hours, and the fit. If I had to simplify what is the evolutionary principle, it is that things that require the least amount of get mine to create the greatest amount of grow hours flourish.
You cut out a little bit there, but I think you said the things that require the least amount of get mine to create the most amount of get hours flourish.
Right. That's exactly what I was saying. Yeah. So when you watch that video or you read his book, you'll see this pattern all over the place. And if you think about it, if we take off this weird perverted lens that we've put on about like competition, survival of the fittest, and we just look at it, for example, in another ecosystem, let's call it the marketplace, a company that requires less resources, capital, labor, time, less inputs to produce greater value that it can share to the marketplace is going to outcompete a company that requires more inputs to produce less value to the marketplace, right? Like it's kind of like duh when we look at it in that context, but for some reason we've perverted our lens that we look at nature as if it's all competitive and not cooperative. And anyway, so for me, that's a really critical thing. And part of what we, in our shifting to a flow model and creating appropriate membranes and creating coherence, systems that can build coherence at all these different levels, and the semantics and meaning that can keep this one-dimensional reductive pattern, sense of value and that kind of stuff from just feeding sociopathic behavior and all those types of things. That's what becomes possible for us to restore that fit so we can actually heal all those negative externalities and all the damage that we're doing through the sociopathic patterns. And I think we have that capacity, and we're actually kind of on the edge of that kind of shift. And then the other thing that I want to say, you talked about currency as signals. And all language is signals, right? The thing that makes currency really interesting to me is that these signals, if you think about it, are sort of object-centric, right? These signals are like the words coming out of my mouth. I is the subject of the sentence. I have to speak by stringing together objects, right? We have the subject, verb, object, indirect object, direct object. We have prepositions that end, prepositional phrases that start with a preposition, end in an object. We have like all of these different things. It's like we're talking about the way that objects are banging against other objects. To me, it seems that it's a very object-centric language. And I don't just mean English. I mean most human language. There's supposedly some that have been different, some native languages. I don't know them well enough to vouch for that. But if you take object-centric language to its logical extreme, I think what you end up with is Western scientific materialism, reductive materialism, as if everything is just objects bouncing off of objects. And great, we've gotten to its logical extreme. Now, what is the language of flow? And what's interesting to me, currency, which is about currents, and another thing that you'll get to if you watch the Upward Spiral video link that I send and read his book, is that flows have multiple levels, right? There's the flow, there's the level of the water molecules that are flowing in the river or whatever. But then there's the level that is the river, the water level of the river, or the, right, like the aggregate level and the micro level that's actually flowing. And our attention tends to go toward the macro level, and we forget about the micro patterns, and
because they're harder for us to detect and observe, and
right.
There's too much detail there that it's like, The
thing that's interesting to me about currencies is that they embody those two levels. There's the level of the tokens, and the tokens are the micro level of flow, and then there's the balances and the system, and there's a whole other macro level of flow. And so currencies, to me, what makes them so powerful is that they are a symbolic embodiment of flow. If spoken language is a language of objects, currencies are a language of flow. And if we're moving toward a flow-centric paradigm and we need to figure out how to create healthy patterns of flow together, currencies are the language of those patterns of flow.
Yeah.
And that's where the real power lies. And anyway. Yeah.
And because of that composability, I'm getting some feedback all of a sudden. Weird. I wasn't getting that at all before. Because of that it seems like it's gone away now. Because of that composability of them to be separate and together, there's an added benefit there that I think the types of currency architectures that you guys are mapping out creates, and it's that it's the ability to have those individual tokens be composed in different ways, so that I can look at them as a whole unit, and somebody else can look at just this portion and see a different layer of, they're only counting the votes of the vegetarians, or or only people who themselves have been rated highly in terms of their past predictability, predictive accuracy, et cetera, and that ability to have those composed at multiple coherences. At the end of the day, we're not going to have them be infinite. Right? There's an infinite capacity, but they're not going to be infinite. There's still going to be all the usefulness sort of stuff applied. People are going to go, well, that one's great. I'm going to go ahead and support that or adopt that or take that piece and use it in something else. We're not going to, like that was something I kind of mapped out 8 years ago when I first kind of started diving into this stuff, was really, for me, that actually had to do with caching. How do you cache what layers do you cache the various compositions, so that the stuff could serve quickly. Anyway, that's something that you would understand, and people at home maybe that would be a more esoteric conversation we don't have to dive into. But I'm fully there with you. I love that awareness of how those signals are able to communicate at both levels, and that ability is what ends up enabling it to communicate across sort of boundaries of shared context. Meaning, like, I can take it and interpret it this way, and you are in a totally different context, and we'll disregard half of it and take something else, and not only will receive that signal, but will then interpret it in a different way or make use of it in a different way. And so it enables that. It enables the thing that at the end of the day is really my big goal, which is regulation amidst disagreement, right? Kind of coming back to your whole multiple layers of coherence. We're never going to agree about all of the details of everything, and we shouldn't, right? When you look at an ecosystem, that's all of these different little things perceiving their environment in different ways, tuning into, hey, there's food for me over here, and that doesn't look at all like food for somebody else. And so I'm going to go over here and take care of this problem, and convert this thing into another thing. And then somebody else is able to go, wow, look at that other thing that's available for me. And you get each of those steps ends up being something that creates value, that something else comes along and figures out how to make use of. And so that your whole transforming energy into different forms or more useful forms of energy is really about value creation at one sense. I had a conversation with a buddy of mine who is 86, 88 the other day, and he's very smart. He's a political scientist from Chicago School of Economics. Love him to death. We had a good kind of a tense conversation at one point, and he was basically going, in my mind, at the end of the day, it's like Malthus and Darwin are sort of like the two things that at the end of my life, I'm like, yeah, those are the things that sort of describe how ecosystems work. And he really, at the end of the day, was kind of thinking that this is going to be a war of all against all, and there's nothing we can do to prevent a particular reaching the boundaries of what our ecosystem can support, and then the chaos that results from that. And I'll sort of outline his thing here. So basically, I don't know if you can see that, but he's got this like population versus time graph, right? And this is if there was no resource limit, if this resource limit didn't exist, your population would just continue to grow, right? And he goes, oh, but because there is a resource limit, the line actually ends up looking like this. You end up having something that's more, it goes up, and then as it starts to come up against the resource constraints, you begin to sort of level out. And this whole period from basically at the point at which the slope changes and it starts to kind of turn back the other way, that's where you go.
The inflection.
Thank you. At that inflection point is where you go from more people equals more wealth created to more people per capita equals more people equals, you know, more wealth in total maybe, but less per capita. And there's all kinds of chaos and stuff that comes in. And in his mind, like, there's no way for us to change this. And he basically says, you know, if you come up with new technology, that's great, but all that new technology is going to do is move this line up. And from my perspective, that's the problem with the people who are seeking abundance, right? When you're seeking abundance, all you're really going to get, let me turn that off. All you're really going to get is a shift in the line, not a change in the game. But my belief is that the stuff that you're working on and that I'm wanting to build does this. It enables us to sense and feel the pain of those upper limits earlier, and thus have something like this be the case, right? Where you end up, because you are able to feel that pain, you don't actually push up against those limits because your community starts to check its own population growth, use of resources, etc. And that is sustainable, but it's something that the people who are trying to move beyond pain, the people who are trying to make it so that, you know, we've got so much that we don't have to care about it, they're missing the point entirely.
Yeah, there's a couple things about that. And in his graph, if you actually hit the carrying capacity of the system, you tend to fall back down because you've depleted resources. And the system isn't a fixed thing. The system is a dynamic thing.
Yeah.
And it has a particular level of carrying capacity at the moment, but the faster you deplete it, the system carrying capacity diminishes. So one of the things about the kind of thing that you're talking about in terms of an empathetic is you can start to map where you want to be in relationship to the carrying capacity, and you can do two things. You can slow your growth and consumption, or you can raise the carrying capacity. Because yes, it's a finite planet, but most of the important resources are renewable. And so when you can change renewal rates, when you can switch from harvesting old growth, you know, rainforests to bamboo annual renewal crop type things, or, you know, getting paper from hemp instead of from trees, and getting, you know, like there's
a lot you can do on that side. Yeah.
There's a lot you can do about the renewable patterns that actually increase that barrier. But I want to point to something else that you were talking about in terms of in all the examples that you gave, you needed more than just one dimension of information, right? You need identity, for example, for much of the information to be useful. So the whole kind of Bitcoin blockchain, digital anonymous cash approach to things doesn't get you very useful, rich flow information, right? And even then, there is the small amount of identity that's there is being used in useful ways, where people are saying, well, this is the account number that the Bitcoin ID, the account number that this thing went to, and then there's these other things associated with it, and it was published here by this person, so we know that was this person. So there is, even though it's kind of pseudo-anonymous, there is at least continuity of pseudo-anonymity, which, you know, can be tracked in certain patterns, and that's where some of the interesting patterns are being, are happening. But yeah, I think there's just so many more layers that we need of information that we need to have the currencies wed to.
Yeah. There's a lot more that we could go into on all that stuff, I'm sure. But I think I've covered the bulk of like the dive in that I wanted to. So
awesome. Cool. I pasted the upward spiral video link, my edited version, into the chat. So that chat will go away when you close this.
Yes. For those of you watching from home, it's youtube.com/watch?v equals capital R, small u, capital B, capital M, small p, small c, underscore 3, capital S, 04. Hey, terrible, right? Terrible. And I will try to post, I'll post that link
we'll put it,
anywhere.
We'll put it in the comments.
We post it. Yeah. Trying to pause it. Starting to play. Cool. Arthur, I would love, Eric had let me sit in on a couple of tutorials or he called them pair coding, or pair programming sessions, but I called them rubber ducking because I was more like sitting there like the rubber duck that you would talk to when you're trying to debug something. I definitely want to do more of that stuff. But I also want to figure out other ways to kind of help move Scepter and MetaCurrency along, or help support that stuff. So,
awesome.
I'm going to go ahead and stop the broadcast.
Okay. And I put the video link